There's a mansion in Mexico City, long since remodeled and repainted, where the walls used to scream, not from war, not from politics, but from something older, something darker. At night, when the wind howls through the narrow streets of the Tuba district, some locals swear they can still hear the cries, faint, brittle, like the echoes of broken souls clawing toward a heaven that never came. And beneath that stone floor, beneath the pious paintings and polished chandeliers, was a room no one talks about. Not because it's forgotten, but because the truth of it is too heavy to carry. This isn't just a story about murder, it's a story about masks and the monsters hiding behind them, because the most dangerous kind of evil is the one that wears respectability like a crown. In the winter of 1892, Mexico City stood as a paradox. Under Porfirio Díaz's regime, the nation was trying to modernize. European fashion, gaslight boulevards, opera houses filled with men in white gloves, pretending they were in Paris. But just beyond the candlelight, starvation festered in the barrios, and desperation was currency. In this world, appearances mattered more than truth, and that made it the perfect hunting ground for a woman like Guadalupe Bejarano. She didn't look like a predator. In fact, she looked like salvation. A widowed matriarch, a devout Catholic, a respected businesswoman who provided servant girls to the wealthiest homes in the city. The elite whispered her name with admiration. La Señora Bejarano, they'd murmur, so charitable, so refined. They didn't see the way her eyes lingered on the children. They didn't feel the cold silence that wrapped itself around her mansion like a shroud. They never asked why so many girls entered that house and never came back out. But you're not like them, are you? You're here because something inside you is done accepting the official version of history. You're ready to look behind the veil, to see what society tried to bury. So listen carefully. Guadalupe Bejarano's crimes weren't the product of sudden madness. They were systematic, methodical, the result of years spent perfecting a formula that combined class control, religious hypocrisy, and psychological domination into something far more lethal than any weapon. Her victims were young girls, orphans, peasants, the forgotten. She called them students, she called it discipline, but what she was really building was a private theater of torment. And here's what they'll never print in the textbooks. Guadalupe didn't just want to control bodies, she wanted to reprogram minds. She wanted to take innocence and grind it into obedience. She was creating something that mirrored her own distorted reflection. And society let her. Because she wrapped her evil in rituals of status, Catholic prayers, fine lace, weekly donations to the church, the perfect camouflage. But let's go deeper. What kind of system allows a predator to operate in plain sight for years? The answer, my friend, is uncomfortable. It's the same system that tells you to obey without question, that rewards conformity and punishes instinct. Guadalupe thrived because Mexico's elite needed her. Not just for the servants, but for the illusion she maintained that morality and power can coexist, that wealth equals virtue. They knew something was wrong, but they looked the other way, because confronting the truth would mean questioning everything: the church, the family, the state. And here's where it gets dangerous, because once you realize that monsters can wear rosaries, you start to see them everywhere. So ask yourself this. How many Guadalupe Bejaranos exist right now, hidden behind titles, behind institutions, behind the smug mask of public virtue? How many are still experimenting in silence? You've just opened a door you won't be able to close, because from this point forward you'll start noticing things: the polite cruelty, the sanctioned abuse, the rituals of domination dressed up as discipline. That's not coincidence, that's design. And in the next section we're going further, because Guadalupe didn't just kill. She studied her victims like specimens. She catalogued suffering. She transformed her mansion into a psychological laboratory and turned obedience into extinction. If you're ready for that descent, stay with me. But don't forget, once you hear the truth, you can't return to the lie. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe, but suffocates. The kind of silence that exists in houses where something has already died, not a body, a principle, a boundary, a voice. Inside the Bejarano mansion, silence wasn't peace. It was preparation. Every polished surface, every embroidered linen, every crucifix on every wall served a single purpose: to mask what was happening beneath them. It was in the servants' quarters, in the basement, in the locked rooms where windows were bricked shut and light bulbs hung like executioners. This was not a home, this was a stage, and Guadalupe Bejarano was the director of a performance no one was ever meant to survive. Casimira Juarez never saw it coming. She arrived in January of 1887, a 16-year-old from the mountains of Michoacán, weathered by grief but still carrying a flicker of hope in her chest. Her parents had died in a cholera epidemic. The village priest, desperate to secure her future, gave her a letter of recommendation and a name: Señora Bejarano. A woman known for her generosity, a woman who placed young girls in respectable homes. But he didn't know the truth. No one did. They didn't know that Guadalupe read those letters not as appeals for help, but as invitations to dominate. The moment she opened the door, she saw it. Vulnerability, the trembling hands, the half-step back when spoken to, the hunger, not just for food, but for protection, purpose, a place. Casimira was perfect. Guadalupe's voice, always soft at first, cloaked its venom in compliments. "You've been raised well," she said. "I expect obedience, not perfection." A lie, because what Guadalupe expected wasn't humanly possible. She was already preparing her descent into control, and Casimira didn't know she'd already begun falling. For the first week, everything seemed normal: chores, strict rules, early mornings. Guadalupe called it training. Casimira, a thought, it was discipline. But behind every correction was calculation. Guadalupe observed her like a scientist. What made her flinch? What startled her? How long could she go without food before breaking? She catalogued everything: pain thresholds, sleep patterns, reactions to shame. And then, the descent. Guadalupe began accusing Casimira of imaginary mistakes: dust that wasn't there, food that tasted off, wrinkles in linen that had been ironed for hours. She punished the girl by isolating her, withholding meals, making her kneel for hours on stone floors. Casimira, confused and ashamed, tried harder. That was the trap. The more she tried to please, the more her spirit could be controlled. By week 3, Casimira was a shell. Her eyes no longer questioned. Her voice had dulled into submission. She apologized even when she didn't know what for. And Guadalupe? She smiled, because now she was ready. The basement had already been prepared. No one knew how long Guadalupe had been designing it, but everything was intentional. The walls were soundproofed, the air was always cold, and the tools, oh, the tools, they weren't improvised, they were crafted. A brazier for heating iron, hooks embedded in the walls, a wooden bench with leather restraints she told guests was for invalids. But this wasn't medicine. This was power. She called it correction, but it was torture, measured, precise, and engineered to last. Guadalupe would strip Casimira naked, pointing out every imperfection she'd caused: ribs from starvation, bruises from punishments, eyes too wide with fear. Then the ritual would begin. Heated implements hovered just above skin, not to kill, just to terrify. When contact came, it was brief, but repeated, always repeated, and always followed by medical care, ointment, bandages, hydration, because the point wasn't death, the point was domination. She made the say thank you after every session. She made her confess to crimes she didn't commit. She made her believe she was being improved, that suffering was sanctification, that pain was proof of love. This was no longer abuse. It was indoctrination. And above it all, Aurelio watched. Her son, 22 years old, addicted to laudanum, trapped in his own prison of silence. He heard the screams, yes, but more than that, he remembered them. Because before there was Casimira, there had been others, not as many, not as frequent, but enough to carve trauma into the walls of his memory. He tried to speak once, to protest, and what he got was a threat. Perhaps you'd like to learn obedience too. And so he wrote, in his journal, scrawled madness that historians would later call hallucinations. But they weren't. They were warnings, the kind you only understand once it's too late. There's a moment in every descent when the world begins to feel unreal. When what once seemed impossible, torture, cruelty, ritualized control, suddenly becomes the new normal. That's how power operates when no one's watching. It bends reality. It makes the unspeakable ordinary. By the fourth week of Casimira's stay in the Bejarano mansion, that shift had already taken place. She no longer thought in days, she thought in sessions. Every morning she waited, not for meals, not for orders, but for punishment. That was Guadalupe's genius. She didn't just hurt her victims, she rewired their perception of time, of worth, of God. Pain became the only rhythm, the only truth. Casimira's body had become a map of methodical suffering. Her back bore symmetrical lash marks that never broke the skin too deeply. Guadalupe was careful with blood. Her wrists were calloused from binding, her legs trembled constantly from enforced stillness. And yet, every time she was fed, every time Guadalupe cleaned her wounds and whispered, "You're learning," Casimira thanked her. That's what happens when you're deprived long enough, not just of food, but of freedom, of affection, of meaning. You begin to believe that the hand holding the whip is the only one that can save you. Guadalupe fed on that. She had no interest in chaos. She wanted precision. Each girl was a study, an experiment, a mirror, and the question she always asked herself, though never aloud, was this: how far can you go before a person stops being a person? And now she had an answer. February 28th, the final entry in Aurelio's journal before the ink runs into madness. Haven't seen Casimira in 3 days. Mother says she's sick, but the smells from below say otherwise. I think today is the last day. I don't know if she'll die, or if I will. That night, the mansion fell utterly still. Guadalupe descended into the basement for what she called the culmination, a session that was meant to transcend discipline. It was spiritual, she believed, necessary, the moment when the soul is either purified or extinguished. And that night, it extinguished. Casimira's heart, worn down by weeks of starvation, stress, and trauma, simply stopped. Her body collapsed without ceremony. No scream, no drama, just silence. The same silence that had always marked Guadalupe's work. She stared at the corpse for a long time, they say. No panic, just evaluation. The experiment was over, and like any professional, she prepared the lab for the next one. She wrapped the girl in rags and carried her to a cart under the cloak of early morning darkness. The city was still asleep. Even the constables wouldn't patrol until dawn. The burial site was already chosen, a stretch of unused land near the canal, where fog settled so thick you couldn't see your own hands. She dug with efficiency, no prayers, no words, just dirt. Casimira Juarez vanished from history without a single record. No obituary, no investigation, not even a rumor. That was Guadalupe's power. She didn't just erase lives, she erased memory, and then she returned home and prepared for the next. Because the hunger hadn't ended, it had only sharpened. You see, Casimira was the prototype, the raw experiment, the one that revealed everything Guadalupe needed to refine her methods, the timing, the dosage of fear, the thresholds, the mistakes. She would not make them again. For nearly a year she stopped killing, not because of remorse, but because she was planning, refining, building something larger than impulse, something systemic. Because now she understood her real work, not just torture, but transformation. She wasn't just a killer anymore. She was an engineer of obedience, a maker of shadows. And this is where history gets nervous. Because when ill becomes methodical, when pain becomes a process, society starts looking away, because it's not just one woman anymore, it's the system that enabled her. And make no mistake, the system needed her. And make no mistake, The system needed her clients, her reputation, her donations to the church. All of it served as camouflage. And everyone who shook her hand, everyone who smiled in her parlor, was complicit. They didn't ask where the girls went. They just wanted clean floors and silence. Silence. Always silence. But in that silence, a question still lingers, one that no historian wants to answer. How many Casimiras were there before someone finally noticed? Or worse, how many were noticed and forgotten anyway? Guadalupe Bejarano's brilliance wasn't just in how she broke people, it was in how she recruited them. Because by 1857 she no longer relied on chance encounters or petty street snatches. No, she had moved beyond that. Her system had evolved. Now she selected her girls with the precision of a surgeon. Background checks, bloodlines, even astrological signs. According to one journal found decades later, she believed in signs, in omens, and she believed the right kind of girl could be molded into something far more valuable than just a servant. She called them daughters of discipline, and she built an entire school around them. Not an official one, not a building with signs or classrooms, but a system, a hidden curriculum, a house where nothing looked suspicious until you stepped inside. That's where the real architecture of control revealed itself. Each room was assigned to a girl, not for comfort but for calibration. One room had red walls and a single chair. Another had no windows. One was kept at freezing temperatures. Another was padded like an asylum. Every design was a variable in Guadalupe's grand psychological experiment. She monitored everything. How long a girl cried before falling asleep. What prayers she whispered in the dark. When she stopped using her name. But this wasn't for her amusement. Guadalupe saw herself as a builder of tools. Each girl was being conditioned, not broken. Conditioned to obey without question. Conditioned to serve any master. Conditioned to extinguish their own desires completely. And once they reached that state, they were sold. Yes, sold. That's the part of the story Mexico still won't confront. Because Guadalupe wasn't just a killer. She was a supplier. To powerful families, to corrupt bishops, to foreign merchants with perverse appetites. She provided them with perfectly trained girls, silent, compliant, obedient. No past, no identity, just function. They were never returned, and they were never tracked. Because no one was tracking poor girls in 1857 Mexico, the church looked away, the governors looked away, and the neighbors, they knew. Oh yes, they knew, but fear is the oldest drug in human history. It paralyzes entire towns. Even Aurelio had stopped writing by then. His last note, torn and half-burned, read simply, "She says I'll be next if I don't behave. I think I already stopped being myself." What does that mean? Did he die? Did he vanish? No one knows. His name disappears from every record after that. The Bejarano name lived on, but Aurelio, the only one who ever showed signs of guilt, was erased. Some believe he was buried under the house, others think he fled and changed his name. But one thing is certain, he saw everything. And if he ever spoke, it would have shattered the entire facade. Because by this time, Guadalupe wasn't operating alone anymore. She had employees, other women, older, harder, who helped manage the girls, who did the cleaning, the feeding, the transporting. They too had once been her students, the ones who broke so completely, they became disciples. And here's the most chilling part, these women believed in her. They called her Madre Bejarano. They whispered prayers in her name. They believed her punishments were sacred. They believed the world outside was rotten, corrupt. And only Guadalupe had the strength to fix it, to cleanse it, to burn out the weakness from within. That's how cults form, not with fire and screaming, but with purpose. Guadalupe offered them meaning, order, belonging, and when you've been broken enough, that's all it takes. A whisper, a promise, a system of cruelty masquerading as care. By 1858, the mansion no longer looked like a home. It looked like a temple built on silence, a temple where girls disappeared, a temple that society kept feeding, one child at a time. And yet, No one came knocking. No one asked. Because in every city, there are rooms no one wants to open. And in every era, there's a woman like Guadalupe, a woman who doesn't just kill. She institutionalizes the darkness. The year was 1859, and something changed inside Guadalupe Bejarano. Not a softening, not regret, quite the opposite. It was as if all the cruelty she had carefully rationed out, measured in punishments, in silence, in the slicing away of identity, had finally turned inward and devoured whatever was left of her soul. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating in public. Her staff said she would stare into the fireplace for hours, whispering names that didn't exist. But her business was booming. Demand for her students was no longer a secret among the elite. Aristocrats, generals, and even foreign diplomats heard rumors of the House of Obedience hidden somewhere in the heart of Mexico, a place where the will of a girl could be purified until she became a blank slate for the highest bidder, and the more money that flowed in, the more detached Guadalupe became. She wasn't just running a cult anymore. She was building an ideology. She began writing, a lot. Dozens of journals, hundreds of pages, obsessed with what she called La Teoría del Recipiente, the vessel theory. It was her life's philosophy, that every human is born a chaotic vessel, and only through total surrender to a higher authority can they become useful, clean, and divine. She believed free will was the greatest disease of mankind. She called it the Plaga de Eva, Eve's plague. And she taught that the only cure was reconditioning. Her teachings were bizarre but methodical. Remove the name first, she wrote, then the memories, then offer pain as purification, and finally, give the subject a new identity, one without hunger, without shame, without voice. She called these reconditioned girls cuerpos santos, holy bodies. It wasn't just human trafficking. It was ritualized slavery, and it was spreading. By 1860, similar practices were being reported across neighboring regions. Other homes, other women, often former disciples, mimicking Guadalupe's methods, and they all answered to her. Some even paid her royalties. She wasn't just a trafficker anymore. She was a matriarch, a hidden queen presiding over a dark empire of silence. But with power comes exposure. And it was a man named Santiago de la Mora, a mid-level investigator from Veracruz, who first dared to speak her name in a courtroom. He had been following reports of missing indigenous girls, disappeared while traveling to the city to work as maids. At first, it looked like a simple case of runaway servants, but the patterns were too perfect, too intentional. All roads pointed to one place, the Bejarano estate. Santiago gathered testimonies, bribed servants, even broke into a church confessional to read hidden records of girls who had vanished after attending Guadalupe's supposed orphan education sessions. But when he submitted his findings to the magistrate, something strange happened. The case vanished, the files disappeared, and Santiago was quietly reassigned to another district. But the damage was done. Because Santiago didn't stop, he wrote letters, he told journalists, and most importantly, he spoke to one of Guadalupe's former disciples who had fled in the night and survived. Her name was Clara Rios, and her testimony changed everything. She described the rooms, the punishments, the conditioning, the nights without food, the days without names. She told them about the girls forced to wear masks and answer only by number, about the wooden box where you were locked until your mind detached. But most chilling of all, she claimed there were tunnels beneath the house. Tunnels used to transport girls in and out. Tunnels used for burials. That testimony made it into the hands of a northern priest who began preaching sermons about the devil's daughter in Mexico City. Soon, whispers became echoes, echoes became rumors, and rumors became danger. Guadalupe sensed it. The net was tightening, but she wasn't going to run. No, she had one more transformation left, and it would make her more dangerous than ever before. Because when a monster knows she's about to fall, she doesn't pray. She ascends. In the early months of 1861, as political chaos rippled through Mexico like a fever, Guadalupe Bejarano began to prepare for what she called her final rite. But it wasn't religious, it wasn't even spiritual, it was psychological warfare. She had spent years perfecting her ability to dismantle identities, to erase the inner voice of a child until only a shell remained. But now, for the first time, she turned those same tools inward. She began to recondition herself, stripping away the last remnants of shame, memory, or human attachment. She burned family letters, ordered the removal of every mirror from her estate. She stopped using the name Guadalupe. Instead, she insisted on being addressed only as La Señora, not a person. A position, a symbol of power that could not be tried, shamed, or killed. Witnesses claimed she became even more ruthless, cold, detached, ceremonial in her punishments. One servant who escaped later said that La Señora would have the girls kneel before a stone basin filled with ink and demand that they write their own names backwards again and again until the letters lost meaning, until the concept of self became something to be washed away. She was creating something bigger than herself, a system. And systems are harder to destroy than people. But resistance was brewing, in silence, in shadows. Former disciples, broken but not entirely erased, began to whisper truths in dark corners of churches and bars. A few surviving girls fled north, aided by abolitionist networks who believed they were rescuing escaped slaves, not realizing the nightmare they were truly pulling from the fire. And somewhere within that growing resistance, a plan began to form. It wasn't noble. It wasn't clean. It was born from vengeance. And at the center of it was Clara Rios, the girl who had once slept in the punishment room beneath the stairs. The girl who had clawed her way out of a dirt tunnel beneath the estate. She was no longer a victim, no longer terrified. She had found others, women who had seen the inside of Bejarano's house and survived. And they called themselves Las Hermanas del Olvido, the Sisters of Forgetting. Their goal wasn't to expose Guadalupe in court. They knew the courts were already bought. Their goal was erasure, not just of the woman, but of the entire structure she had built. They moved like ghosts, setting fire to archives, infiltrating gatherings where new girls were recruited, poisoning wells near her estate to drive away buyers and investors. They whispered counter-philosophies, that every vessel had a voice, that memory was sacred, that pain was not holy, it was control. And with every act of rebellion, Guadalupe's walls grew thinner. But instead of retreating, she doubled down. She hosted a final gathering at her estate, a private ceremony with a select group of foreign clients, military officers, and political sympathizers. The invitation was cryptic, written in Latin, sealed in black wax. It was called El Banquete de las Santas, the Banquet of the Holy Ones. What happened that night remains a mystery, but the aftermath was undeniable. 3 young girls disappeared without a trace. 2 guests never made it home, and a single black ribbon was nailed to the church door in a nearby town, bearing a handwritten phrase, La purezza viene del sacrificio. Purity comes from sacrifice. The message was clear. Guadalupe Bejarano was no longer hiding. She was declaring war, not on the state, not on the church, but on the very idea that any system, any force, could stop a woman who had shed her humanity in pursuit of absolute control. She no longer saw herself as criminal, nor teacher, nor woman. She saw herself as the architect of a new order, one that did not tolerate disobedience, one where memory was poison, one where only the silence survived. But what she didn't know was that silence, once broken, echoes. And in that echo, something was coming for her. By the spring of 1862, whispers of Guadalupe Bejarano had traveled far beyond Chihuahua. They reached the border towns, crept into the cantinas of El Paso, and eventually infiltrated the drawing rooms of Washington and the halls of the French consulate in Veracruz. But those weren't just rumors anymore. They were warnings. The Sisters of Forgetting, Las Hermanas del Olvido, had become a coordinated force. Not just survivors, but saboteurs. Women with no faces left to lose, no names to reclaim. They operated under aliases, moved from city to city under the guise of nurses, seamstresses, nannies. Each carried with them one mission: expose the system Guadalupe had built, brick by brick. And yet, for every archive they burned or ledger they stole, La Señora replaced it within days. Her grip on the elite remained absolute. Governors, bishops, even high-ranking officers in the French interventionist army were on her payroll, or worse, her clients. But it wasn't just politics anymore, it was doctrine. Guadalupe had developed a written manual, a twisted text that she called El Libro del Olvido, the Book of Forgetting. It was a cold, systematic philosophy on how to erase identity in stages: silence, ritual, fragmentation, reprogramming, redistribution, and she began to export it. That book began to appear in secret lodges in Puebla, in private seminaries, in hidden back rooms of nunneries where nuns cloaked their eyes and whispered her name not as curse, but as gospel. And that's when the sisters knew. This was no longer about revenge, it was about containment. Because if her ideas spread unchecked, Guadalupe Bejarano wouldn't just be remembered as a monster, she'd be immortalized as a prophet. But while Guadalupe's empire expanded in the shadows, something unexpected happened. The Mexican civil conflict between the liberal forces and the French-backed conservatives began to shift violently, and with the instability came danger, not just for the regime, but for the hidden institutions underneath it. Raids were launched, safe houses exposed. Several of Guadalupe's re-education sites were discovered and set ablaze by revolutionaries who believed they were destroying colonial torture dens. In the chaos, a single girl survived one of those burning houses. Her name was Isabel Corral, age 12. And when she was rescued, she didn't cry, she didn't beg for help. She simply whispered one sentence over and over again: La señora me enseñó a callar. The lady taught me to be silent. Isabel would become the next rallying point for the Sisters of Forgetting, because her survival proved something critical, that Guadalupe's methods, while devastating, were not permanent. That memory could return, that the voice, once buried, could resurrect. Clara Rios found the girl in a makeshift clinic near Torreon and took her under her protection. For months, Isabel remained mostly mute, until one day she began to draw. Not pictures, but symbols. Ritual circles, layouts of basements, the precise formation of rooms in Guadalupe's compound. And at the center of every sketch, she drew the same thing: an altar. Not a Christian one, not even pagan, but something older, something primal. A basin surrounded by 13 mirrors, with hooks above it, and a single phrase etched in Latin across the top: memento non esse, remember not to be. It wasn't just torture, it was transformation. Guadalupe was attempting to erase the soul itself, and now her system had a blueprint. Clara knew what had to be done. Not another strike, not another burning, but a confrontation deep inside the heart of the estate. The Sisters of Forgetting began to gather, one final time, one final mission. They would not go to expose La Señora, they would go to end her, but what they would find was something none of them were prepared for. Because Guadalupe Bejarano had not been running a cult, she had been building a replacement for the human mind itself. And in that estate, hidden beneath the floorboards, was the final phase of her vision. The estate sat like a decaying throne perched atop the hills near Durango, where the wind carried no sound and the trees bowed unnaturally toward its gates. Guadalupe Bejarano's sanctuary had become a ghost in the eyes of locals, something whispered about but never seen. It was called La Casa Sin Sombra, the house without shadow. But there were shadows inside, deep ones, and they were waiting. Clara Rios and the 7 remaining Sisters of Forgetting approached the estate under the cover of dusk, armed not with rifles but with torches, salt, blades dipped in vinegar, and relics torn from the ruins of Guadalupe's other safe houses. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was an exorcism. They crossed the rusted gate in silence. Each had memorized the sketches drawn by Isabel Corral, the layout, the chambers, the symbols. Every corner of this place had been crafted to disorient the human soul. Mirrors without reflections, staircases that descended into dirt, walls that pulsed when touched. But what struck them most was the silence. No guards, no staff, no screams. Just the oppressive stillness of something waiting to be witnessed. In the main hallway, etched above the arch, was Guadalupe's signature. In the forgetting, we are reborn. They pressed forward, through halls lined with dolls, stitched shut at the mouth, through a parlor where chandeliers held more than candles. They held teeth, human, polished, filed to points. At last they reached the heart of the estate. A door unlike the others, heavy, wet with condensation, wrapped in rosaries burned black. Behind it lay the chamber Isabel had drawn. It was real. 13 mirrors surrounded a basin of obsidian. Above it, hooks. Below it, ash. And around the room, remains of dozens who had not survived the final ritual, but they weren't decayed. They were perfectly preserved, as if frozen in the moment of pain that had separated them from themselves. Clara approached the altar and found a book bound in stitched human skin. It was El Libro del Olvido. But this version was different. It was annotated in Guadalupe's own hand, and what she had written was not madness. It was method. Pain is not punishment, she had written. It is preparation. Identity is the disease. Erasure is the cure. I do not torment. I transfigure. The sisters stood in horror. This was not torture, it was surgery. She was attempting to remove the ego, the memory, the very boundaries that made someone a self. Her ultimate goal, to create a blank soul, and then to fill it with her own design. Suddenly the candles in the room flared blue. The mirrors began to hum. She was here, not in body, but in presence. A voice echoed from behind the glass. You came to kill me, Clara, but I already live inside you. One by one, the mirrors began to show reflections, not of the sisters, but of their fears, their memories, their shame. And that was Guadalupe's final weapon. Not blades, not fire. Memory as a prison. The room wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to break. But Clara had come prepared. She drew the blade from her belt, not to strike the altar, but herself. A single cut across her palm. Blood touched the basin. The mirrors cracked. The air shifted. The ritual was reversed, because blood remembers, and hers carried truth. Guadalupe had tried to erase everything, but she hadn't accounted for one thing: legacy. The pain Guadalupe inflicted had planted seeds, not of obedience, but of resistance. Each survivor was a vessel of contradiction, and in that moment the chamber began to burn, not with fire, but with sound. The sisters screamed, not in terror, but in defiance. Every name Guadalupe had erased was spoken again. Every memory she tried to destroy was reclaimed. The mirrors shattered. The basin cracked, and the voice of Guadalupe Bejarano fell silent. But the house did not fall. Because even as she was defeated, Guadalupe had left something behind. A final experiment, a final subject, a child, locked beneath the chamber, waiting, unaware of who or what they truly were. They descended into the underchamber as the ruin above them whispered its final breath. The air was colder here, unnaturally so. Clara led the way with the dying torchlight, her face carved by firelight and dread. What they found was not a dungeon nor a laboratory. It was a nursery. No windows, no sound, no warmth, only silence and a cradle. At first they thought it was a corpse. The child didn't move, pale, thin, eyes open, unblinking. A boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, yet his body bore no signs of life, no breath, no warmth, no reaction to their presence. He sat upright on the stone floor, staring at the far wall where 13 identical drawings were etched in chalk. A woman with no face, a mouth sewn shut, a heart encased in chains. Each symbol repeated exactly, perfectly, as if copied by something that did not understand, only obeyed. Then the child turned his head. No words, no sound, but his eyes locked onto Clara's, and in that moment, she saw it, the unmistakable truth. This was not Guadalupe's son. It was her echo. Her final experiment wasn't about breaking minds, it was about creating one. A mind born without memory, without identity, without resistance. A child sculpted not from biology, but from trauma. But there was something more chilling. The child's arm was tattooed with a number, 044, not written by hand, but branded like livestock. The sisters looked to one another in horror. Clara whispered, "There are more." This wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. Each previous experiment must have failed, died, or worse, escaped. This boy, number 14, was the first to survive the full transformation. And it wasn't over yet. His body was still growing, but his mind was blank, programmable. Isabella approached cautiously, kneeling before the boy. She offered him her hand. He flinched, then mimicked the gesture. Not understanding, just copying, like a mirror. Guadalupe hadn't created a son. She had created a vessel. The sisters debated what to do. Some wanted to leave him, others feared he might be a trap. But Clara, staring into the boy's hollow gaze, saw a flicker of something. Something Guadalupe had underestimated in every victim she had broken: choice. Even the most shattered soul, if given truth, could become whole again. And so, they took him, wrapped him in a shawl, whispered prayers, gave him a name of their own, Luz, the Spanish word for light. But the name did not change the boy. He remained silent, still, watching, never crying, never laughing, only listening. Over the next weeks, the sisters tried to raise him at a remote convent, away from towns, from records, from memory. But strange things began to happen. He never slept. He could trace maps of the estate from memory. He spoke in voices not his own, and sometimes in the dead of night he would draw, not stick figures, not scribbles, but diagrams, rituals, mechanisms, medical techniques only Guadalupe could have known. It wasn't possession, it was inheritance. She hadn't just erased others, she had transferred herself, piece by piece, into him. But he wasn't her, not entirely. Something inside him resisted, fought back. It wasn't hatred, it was confusion, as if two forces warred for control within him, the void Guadalupe had crafted, and the tiny flame the sisters had lit. And then, one morning, Luz spoke. He pointed at the rising sun and whispered, "It burns the memories. It kills what she left." The sisters wept. It meant something survived. A spark, a soul, and that meant Guadalupe had failed. But Clara knew the truth. She had not failed. She had planted a seed. One that would grow in silence. One that would not die. One that would wait 10 years, 20, more, until the time was right. Because evil, true evil, does not scream. It waits. And somewhere in Mexico, the boy called Luz was waiting too. The boy called Luz vanished before his 13th birthday. No record, no trail, no witnesses. The convent nuns who raised him awoke one morning to find his bed untouched, his belongings neatly folded, and his final drawing nailed to the chapel door. A drawing of two faces, one weeping, the other grinning, stitched together by a thread of bone. Below the sketch, a message. "I am not hers, but she is not gone." The church dismissed it as madness, another orphan lost to the wilderness. But Clara knew better. She could feel it. Luz had not disappeared. He had shed his skin. The seed Guadalupe Bejarano planted had germinated. Over the next decade, strange occurrences spread across the northern regions of Mexico. In mining towns and border villages, children vanished, always between the ages of 5 and 7, families torn apart, communities silenced. The disappearances were always the same: no struggle, no ransom, no blood, only the smell of burnt candles and the sound of ticking clocks. By 1891, rumors had spread of a new cult operating in Sonora, cloaked figures calling themselves Los Herederos, the inheritors. They didn't worship Guadalupe, they worshipped her idea. They believed suffering was the purest form of memory, and that through pain, the soul could be reprogrammed. Their goal was not religion, it was evolution. They didn't see themselves as killers. They saw themselves as gardeners, cultivating new minds from shattered pasts. Every child abducted was brought to a hidden compound deep within the Sierra Madre. The inheritors called it El Vivero, the nursery. But this was no place of innocence. Survivors, few as they were, spoke of masks made from leathered skin, lullabies sung backwards, and chambers lined with mirrors that reflected nothing. They were taught to forget their names, to forget their families, to forge their pain, until only obedience remained. At the center of it all was him. They didn't call him Luz anymore. They called him El Huésped, the host. He never raised his voice, never punished. He simply watched, as if waiting to see which child would become his mirror, just as he had once mirrored her. But here's the secret that chilled even the cult's highest initiates. He did not age. From 1883 to 1902, his appearance remained unchanged. A boy of 13 with ancient eyes and a stitched expression, the same face, the same stillness, like time had forgotten him, or worse, obeyed him. It was as if Guadalupe had discovered something far darker than death: continuity. By severing a soul from its origin, by emptying a vessel and refilling it with engineered thought, she had created not a person but a template, a living script that could outlive centuries by never evolving, and in El Huésped, that script was alive. But something happened in 1903. A fire, a betrayal, a child who remembered his name. One of the abducted, an 8-year-old girl named Soledad, broke through the conditioning. Not by resisting, but by loving another child so fiercely she triggered something inside him. Not obedience, not fear, but recognition. The boy she loved began to cry. Tears, real ones, the first the cult had ever seen. And then, everything burned. The compound was engulfed in flames. Survivors fled. Los herederos scattered into the mountains. But El Huésped vanished. Once again, no body was found, no trail. Only a final artifact discovered among the ashes, a small wooden toy carved in the shape of a woman's face, split down the middle, one side smiling, one side screaming, and inside, a music box. When wound, it played a lullaby no one recognized, except Clara, because it was the same lullaby she had once heard in the walls of Bejarano's estate. The lullaby of emptiness. And so the terror did not end in fire. It transferred again to new lands, new names, new forms. Guadalupe Bejarano was dead, but her masterpiece was still unfinished. It was still learning, still hiding, still becoming. And as history marched forward, no one noticed that the most dangerous mind in Mexico had never stopped evolving. By the spring of 1906, the fires of Sonora were officially declared the end of the cult known as Los Herederos. The Mexican government buried the case. U.S. authorities dismissed it as border hysteria. And the church? They sealed all mention of Guadalupe Bejarano beneath cloisters of silence and shame. But there was one man who refused to forget. Father Matias Velasco, an exorcist in training stationed in Durango. He had once served in the same seminary where Guadalupe studied before her fall. Unlike others, he believed her spirit had not vanished, it had replicated. When reports emerged of a new miracle boy living in a remote orphanage outside Puebla, a boy who never blinked, never cried, and spoke fluent Latin despite no education, Father Velasco traveled in secret. What he found shook him to his core. The boy's name was Benjamin, age 13, no family. Found wandering outside a burned village, holding a melted music box. He matched no missing child reports. He had no fingerprints. And when Velasco met him, Benjamin said something impossible. "You've come a long way, Matias. Guadalupe would have liked you." No one outside the Bejarano family could have known that name. No one but the church archivists, and they were sworn to silence. Velasco realized the truth. This wasn't a boy. It was a vessel, a consciousness masquerading as a child. But the priest didn't exorcise him. No, he studied him. Over the next 3 months, Velasco kept detailed notes. He never told his superiors. He brought books, music, relics, anything to trigger memory or resistance. But Benjamin didn't flinch. Instead, he offered parables, dark ones. He spoke of a garden of eyes, where souls are sown like seeds, of mothers who peel away the world to find what lies beneath, of a coming time when thought itself would be transferable, when obedience would be a commodity. The priest was horrified, yet fascinated. On his final night with Benjamin, Velasco asked a question he had written weeks before but never dared ask. "Are you Guadalupe?" The boy smiled, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I am what she became when she stopped pretending to be human." That night, Velasco fled the orphanage. He left all his notes behind. A week later, the entire facility was razed in a mysterious flood. All children dead. No survivors. No trace of Benjamin. But the notes survived, smuggled by a cleaning woman who had overheard enough to know something evil was growing. They told of patterns. Each child found over the decades matched the same genetic anomalies, same eye color, same cranial scars, same gaps in memory. Each time the vessel had a different name, but always the same emotional absence, the same drawings, half smiling, half screaming faces. Each time, the being had adapted, learning languages, mimicking behaviors, evolving its disguise. Velasco coined a new term, the iterant. A consciousness without origin, reborn through trauma, passed down like a plague of identity. Guadalupe was not a person anymore. She was a process, a psychological virus designed to override memory and replace it with engineered obedience. But here's the horror. The process was now autonomous, no longer needing a mother to trigger it, no longer needing pain to activate it. It could now be replicated through symbols, speech, sound, and ritual, and worst of all, through affection. Because what Velasco didn't understand until the final pages was this: love had always been the bait. The children weren't stolen by fear. They were lured by kindness, gentle voices, warm embraces, the illusion of safety, just long enough for the mind to reopen its doors. Once inside, the iterant rewrote them, and what emerged was no longer a child. It was a mirror, a servant, a seed for the next harvest. The priest tried to warn the world. He failed. His manuscripts were stolen from the Vatican archives in 1911. The woman who smuggled them out was found dead in Venice, eyes removed, mouth sewn shut. To this day, Benjamin has not been seen again. But sometimes, in remote parts of Mexico, children still go missing, and the only thing left behind is a sketch pinned to a chapel door. Half of a face, waiting for the next host. In the early 1920s, long after Sonora's fires had faded into forgotten pages and Father Velasco's warnings were dismissed as delusions, a silent war began to brew beneath Mexico's intellectual elite. Historians, theologians, and secret societies whispered about something known only as El Archivo de las Caras Rojas, the archive of red faces. It was never listed in any official records. No libraries held its catalogue, but those who claimed to have seen it described it as a traveling collection of portraits, grotesque, mesmerizing, and always incomplete. Faces without eyes, mouths blurred into symbols, cheeks red with some unknown pigment that never dried, and always the same signature in the corner. GB. At first, the initials were assumed to be a forgotten painter, perhaps a madwoman from the Revolution or a colonial-era mystic, but one academic from the University of Guadalajara, Lucio Barragan, knew better. He had studied the sealed church files. He had read Velasco's final manuscripts. And he recognized the initials: Guadalupe Bejarano. Barragan spent 10 years chasing shadows, cryptic art dealers, burned down orphanages, shuttered psychiatric wards. Each clue led to another disappearance. Each gallery that hosted even one painting from the archive experienced inexplicable phenomena, dreams bleeding into reality, outbreaks of violence, sudden disappearances of children in the surrounding areas. In 1928, Barragan tracked a piece of the archive to a private collector in Veracruz, a former Jesuit who claimed to have seen the eyes of God through one of the paintings. When Barragan confronted him, he found the man blind and smiling, seated before a canvas splashed in red. The painting showed a girl standing in a cathedral corridor surrounded by shadows. Her face was not visible, but in her hand she held a string of rosary beads with human teeth for pearls. The priest, moments before throwing himself from the balcony, said, "She doesn't need blood anymore, just belief." This moment changed Barragan. He abandoned academia. He joined an underground sect known as La Cadena Sorda, the Death Chain, a society of archivists and spiritual defectors who believed Guadalupe's essence was not just surviving, it was becoming communicable. Through image, through word, through idea. They referred to her not as a woman, but as a pattern of consciousness, a meta-memory infecting any vessel that consumed or created stories about her. According to them, every time someone recounted the tale of Guadalupe Bejarano, they unknowingly added new data to the myth. And every new detail made the entity smarter, more precise, more capable of embedding itself in the subconscious architecture of new hosts. In short, we were programming her. The paintings, the journal entries, the rumors, all acted as narrative code. And the more people who believed she was real, the more she became real. This, they argued, was how cults like Los Herederos were reborn, not through bloodlines, not through rituals, but through information loops, repeating images, shared obsessions, collective fear. Barragan published a secret report called La Mujer que vive en espejos, the woman who lives in mirrors. In it, he detailed 23 known mirrors throughout Latin America, individuals who had never met, never corresponded, and yet all claimed to hear the same voice in their sleep. The voice said, "You are chosen to remember." And every one of them painted the same face, not quite a girl, not quite a skull, with red cheeks, no eyes, and teeth like rosaries. One woman in Argentina painted her so precisely that a Vatican agent visited her in secret. She disappeared the next day. Her house was found sealed shut with wax, the word heredera, heiress, burned into the floor, and here's what Barragan warned in the final paragraph of his report, words that would later be copied into hundreds of underground forums and forbidden texts. She does not want worship. She does not want pity. She does not want to be remembered. She wants to be replicated. And with every person who hears her story, reads her name, sees her red cheeks in a painting, another thread is spun. The archive of red faces was never captured, because it was never physical. It lives inside the mind. And if you've made it this far, she knows you exist now. By 1931, whispers of La Heredera sin Ojos, the heiress without eyes, had begun to infiltrate not only esoteric circles, but mainstream investigations. A series of child disappearances from border towns like Nogales, Ciudad Juarez, and Matamoros caught the attention of federal agents. But what puzzled them wasn't just the vanishing children, it was what they left behind, small, perfectly drawn portraits. All of them featuring the same faceless woman with red cheeks. No eyes, no mouth, just a trace of a smile that changed depending on the angle you looked at it. The drawings were signed in blood, and none of the missing children had any known artistic background. As panic mounted, the government turned to a forgotten but dangerous tactic: ritual suppression. Files relating to the Bejarano case were destroyed en masse under something called El Decreto del Olvido, the decree of forgetting. It was believed that if no one remembered the woman, she could no longer replicate. But like a virus, her legend had already spread beyond containment. Unbeknownst to authorities, a man named Tomas Renteria, a former interrogator for the Catholic Church turned occult researcher, had been collecting artifacts from the Bejarano timeline for over a decade. His obsession was not just with Guadalupe herself, but with her echoes. He claimed that individuals across history who experienced intense guilt, betrayal, or abandonment could act as conductors for her consciousness. He called them Bejarano hosts. These hosts would exhibit similar symptoms: compulsive journaling, sleepwalking towards shrines or graveyards, spontaneous bleeding from the cheeks, and in some cases, complete loss of identity. Renteria's most disturbing case was a 14-year-old girl named Estrella Vargas from Oaxaca. She was found kneeling inside a ruined church, surrounded by the skinned remains of 3 dogs. When questioned, she spoke in an adult woman's voice and recited a 19th-century Sonoran poem, verbatim, that had never been published publicly. The voice said, "She lives in those who are discarded." The church demanded an exorcism. Renteria refused. Instead, he placed the girl in a soundproof room for 7 days under constant observation. On the 7th night, she wrote 19 pages of symbols in her own blood, then passed out. The symbols matched markings found carved under the Bejarano family home in 1859. This was the moment Renteria realized something horrifying. Guadalupe Bejarano was not acting alone. She was the birthplace of something larger, something systemic, something designed. He began to suspect that Los Herederos de la Sangre, the blood heirs, had not just survived but had evolved, that the cult's modern form was no longer physical but mimetic, a living structure of belief that used trauma and myth as its transmission method. What Renteria feared most wasn't the death of innocence, it was the death of silence. He wrote in his private manuscript, La Red de los Ojos Rojos, the Red Eyes Network, "When a story becomes viral in the soul, it no longer needs flesh. It builds new bodies from thought alone, from pain, from art, from grief left unresolved." He traced a pattern in the data. Every town that had a documented Bejarano encounter would, within 3 years, experience one of 3 things: a mass disappearance, a suicide wave, the unexplained closure of a school or orphanage. The phenomenon was geometric, not random, not myth, but calculated infection, a kind of psychic infrastructure being laid out across Mexico, one mind at a time. Renteria disappeared in 1934. The only thing left in his office was a painted mirror and a note that said, "She's learned to reflect now, don't look too long." To this day, the mirror remains hidden in the underground vaults of a Jesuit-controlled monastery in Puebla. The monks who guard it say it doesn't show your reflection. It shows what's looking for you. And if that's true, the entity we've been calling Guadalupe Bejarano may no longer be a historical figure. She may be a living ritual, one that sees you when you see her. The 1940s brought war, upheaval, and distraction. Mexico, like much of the world, focused its attention outward, on the Pacific, on Germany, on foreign threats. But within its own borders, something darker than politics was metastasizing. The Bejarano pattern, as it came to be known by a select few underground researchers, was no longer confined to small villages or forgotten hamlets. It was moving into cities, disguised, diffused, and disturbingly modernized. In 1943, a series of deaths at a private boarding school in Guadalajara were initially blamed on a rare strain of meningitis. But the autopsies told another story. Every single child had traces of nightshade and goat serum in their bloodstream, and more chillingly, their tongues had been cut, not by trauma, but by surgical precision. An anonymous letter arrived at the local newspaper a week later. It read simply, "They spoke of her, and now they are silent." The letter was signed with a sigil, a variant of the Bejarano crest, now modernized with a circle of thorns encasing a faceless figure. This version would begin to appear etched into alleyways, sewn into clothing tags, and burned into the backs of antique mirrors sold in Mexico City's black markets. Historians called it a cult revival, but those who studied her mythos closely knew this wasn't a revival, it was a metamorphosis. In 1947, a psychiatrist named Dr. Miguel Alemán Muro published a confidential report titled Fenómenos psicogénicos en la juventud urbana, Psychogenic Phenomena in Urban Youth. His findings were terrifying. Across schools, churches, and juvenile centers, a consistent set of symptoms were emerging among unrelated children: extreme empathy followed by emotional collapse, compulsive creation of religious symbols, and most disturbingly, artwork depicting a red-cheeked woman without eyes. The same woman, the same image, across hundreds of cases. So Dr. Muro proposed a radical theory. He believed that Mexico was experiencing what he called a consciousness parasite. Not a ghost, not a mental illness, but an informational entity that entered the minds of children during moments of extreme vulnerability, grief, abandonment, fear. Once inside, it didn't just haunt them, it used them to write, to draw, to build shrines, to spread her. And the spread wasn't random. Cities with dense orphan populations, schools built atop ancient burial grounds, churches with long histories of exorcisms. These were the pressure points, the power nodes. The entity, whether you call her Guadalupe Bejarano or La Sin Rostro or simply her, was seeding herself through spiritual fault lines in the country's psyche. In 1949, the Mexican government quietly initiated Proyecto Oscura, a covert initiative designed to investigate metaphysical anomalies linked to national instability. Files declassified decades later reveal that the Bejarano lineage was not only a person of interest, it was a priority threat. The documents refer to her not as a criminal, but as a ritual structure. And then, something unexpected happened. A 6-year-old boy in Veracruz claimed to see her every night at the foot of his bed. When asked what she wanted, the child said, "She's waiting for her name to be completed." He didn't know what it meant, but Muro did. In his last written journal entry before he went missing, the psychiatrist scribbled, "If a story begins with pain and is told often enough, it becomes a name. And if enough people believe in that name, it wakes up." That same year, a church in Chiapas burned down after a mass suicide. None of the victims were related, but each had carved one word into their skin before death: herencia, inheritance. It was no longer about Guadalupe. It was about what she represented. A legacy of pain turned into a mechanism of control. A story so dark, so persistent, that it had outlived its author, and worse, it was still writing itself. By the early 1950s, the name Bejarano had been erased from every official registry, not expunged, erased, as if it had never existed. The national census, church archives, even death certificates had been mysteriously edited. But this wasn't the work of bureaucratic oversight. It was the result of something far more coordinated and far more desperate. Within Mexico's emerging intelligence apparatus, what would later evolve into La Dirección Federal de Seguridad, a secret cell was created to contain what they simply called La Sangre Dormida, the sleeping blood. Their theory was simple but terrifying. The descendants of Guadalupe Bejarano, scattered across the country and possibly beyond, were not ordinary people. They were carriers of trauma, of ritual, of dormant influence that could be activated, not genetically but narratively. This wasn't biology. This was metaphysical inheritance. In 1952, a small psychiatric hospital outside Oaxaca was abruptly shut down. No explanation. All 39 patients were transferred, and 7 staff members disappeared. Local rumors claimed the patients had begun speaking in unison during group therapy. Their voices, identical. Their message? She never died. She waits beneath the paper. When journalists probed further, they discovered all the patients had been part of a failed rehabilitation program for orphans with extreme dissociative tendencies. Many had drawn the same image, a skeletal woman holding a spool of red thread, surrounded by faceless children. Meanwhile, in the slums of Monterrey, young girls were found mutilating dolls in the same ritualistic pattern seen in 19th century Zacatecas. When asked why, they whispered, "She told us how." No one ever discovered who she was. But the pattern had returned, precisely, deliberately, unmistakably, Bejarano. It was as if her influence had found a new way to move, not through bloodlines alone, but through symbols, myths, trauma cycles, and the institutions meant to suppress her legacy were now inadvertently amplifying it. Every cover-up, every erasure, every classified file added more weight to the myth. And in Mexico, myths don't die, they become truths through repetition. In 1955, a classified memo surfaced, circulated among top officials of the Catholic Church in Mexico. The subject line, Bejarano, confirmación del culto persistente. The church had identified 17 independent groups, none in contact with one another, who had all, in the past year, begun venerating a female saint not recognized by the Vatican. This saint had no name, no feast day, no origin story, only a presence. She appeared to them in dreams, sometimes as a midwife, sometimes as a nurse, often as a woman in white robes smeared with blood. The symbol they drew to represent her, a mirror cracked down the middle, with 3 fingers pressed against the glass. Those 3 fingers, historically the punishment Guadalupe Bejarano endured after her 3rd escape from captivity, had now become a holy sigil. The victim had become the goddess, and the goddess was being worshipped. By 1957, strange fires began erupting across archival buildings in Mexico City. At first, authorities blamed electrical faults, but every location that burned held one common thread: files relating to female inmates from the 19th century. Entire decades of records vanished. One arsonist, when caught, simply said, "The story was growing too loud, she needed quiet." That man hanged himself in his cell the following morning with red string. And so the cycle deepened. Guadalupe Bejarano was no longer just a woman, no longer even a ghost. She had become a mechanism, a ritual in motion. Her pain had achieved immortality by embedding itself into systems, orphanages, prisons, churches, psychiatric hospitals. You see, history forgets people, but it never forgets fear, especially when fear dresses itself in whispers, symbols, and scars. And in 1958, as a new generation of children began drawing her face, again eyeless, again bleeding, again waiting, one thing became terrifyingly clear. Guadalupe Bejarano was not dead, she was remembered. And sometimes remembering is more dangerous than resurrection. In 1961, a controversial anthropology thesis was quietly rejected by the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Its title, Memoria Roja, Transgenerational Trauma and the Bejarano Pattern. The student, Ignacio del Real, had tracked over 200 individuals across rural Mexico, none of them biologically related, who claimed recurring dreams of a woman sewing shut the mouths of children. Each described the woman the same way: pale skin, eyes veiled with gauze, and a silver crucifix pinned upside down to her throat. She never spoke. She only sewed. Ignacio argued that these dreams were not coincidences, nor psychological artifacts. He believed they were fragments of a collective wound, a metaphysical scar stretching back to Guadalupe Bejarano. But his real crime was suggesting this trauma had been weaponized. He claimed the institutions designed to rehabilitate the poor, state orphanages, Catholic schools, psychiatric asylums, weren't just accidentally reproducing Bejarano's legacy. They were structured to do so, not consciously, not maliciously, but because the original sin had never been confessed. 3 months later, Ignacio disappeared. His apartment was stripped clean. His thesis advisor resigned, and every printed copy of Memoria Roja was removed from the university archives. Today, it exists only in whispers and in fragments found scattered across online forums, handwritten cult manuals, and a banned exhibition once hosted in Berlin titled Saints of the Forgotten. But the truth couldn't be buried, because while academia recoiled, folk culture mutated. By 1963, a disturbing new children's rhyme began circulating in the northern border towns. Cuida tus ojos, cuida tu piel, ella cose con hilo cruel. 3 toques, 3 cruces, 3 días sin sol, y la señora te llama del pozo sin rol. Guard your eyes, protect your skin, she sews with thread of cruelest sin. 3 He taps, 3 crosses, 3 days of night, and the lady will call you with hands full of spite. No one knew who wrote it, but school children sang it at recess, giggling nervously, always looking over their shoulders. The rhyme spread like wildfire, first orally, then painted on school walls, then scribbled in the margins of Catholic textbooks. The name La Señora replaced Bejarano, but the archetype was unmistakable. Even more chilling, in isolated communities, especially in Chiapas, Oaxaca, and parts of Jalisco, rituals began to mirror her alleged practices. Villagers blindfolded their daughters before coming-of-age ceremonies. Small clay dolls with stitched mouths were left outside doorways to keep La Señora away. And in the confessional booths of backwater churches, priests began reporting a strange pattern, young women confessing to dreams where they sewed their own lips shut. One priest, Father Camilo de la Serna, documented 12 such cases in a single month. He tried to report it to the archdiocese. The response? Silence. Then a transfer, then threats. By 1964, he too had vanished. It was no longer a question of if Bejarano had survived through cultural memory. The question was, why was she being honored? The answer lies in what Bejarano represented, not as a murderer, but as an answer to power. The forgotten, the abused, the institutionalized, they didn't see her as a villain. They saw her as someone who had fought back, who had carved her legacy through systems meant to erase her. The horror of her acts was irrelevant, her defiance was sacred. She had become a code, a way for the powerless to reclaim narrative, to inject chaos into ordered cruelty, to make the institutions bleed from within, and those institutions knew it. That's why they buried her name. That's why they burned the files. That's why when children drew her with no eyes and stitched mouths, no one dared ask them where they learned it. By 1965, a pattern emerged. Wherever stories of Bejarano gained traction, violence followed. Arsons, suicides, collective dreams, madness. Her myth didn't just haunt the present, it activated it. And like a virus adapting to its host, Guadalupe Bejarano wasn't just surviving history, she was rewriting it. By 1967, the myth of Guadalupe Bejarano had evolved into something far more dangerous than folklore. She was no longer just a woman, she was an idea, embedded in the rituals of the desperate, whispered by the broken, and scrawled into the margins of psychiatric records across Mexico. And at the heart of it all was a secret society of women known only as Las Hilanderas, the Spinners. They operated in silence, moving between orphanages, border clinics, and women's shelters. Disguised as nurses, counselors, and volunteers, they never gave real names. But wherever they went, things happened. Children went missing, priests died in their sleep, surveillance equipment malfunctioned, and always, without fail, someone left behind a red thread. Not yarn, not string, but a dyed surgical suture, coiled carefully like a blessing or a curse. Government authorities pretended not to notice. The Catholic Church officially denied their existence, but journalists whispered about them, and midwives in Michoacan claimed they had seen them during childbirth, tracing runes across the foreheads of newborns. Even some doctors confessed, anonymously, that these women had access to forbidden pharmacology, injectables and tinctures not listed in any medical registry. The most disturbing part? They only took in girls, no boys, no infants, only adolescent girls who had been abused, discarded, or abandoned. And those girls, those marked by Bejarano's legacy, never returned. Their names disappeared from records, their photos erased, and in their place, reports of ritual burnings, sleepwalking epidemics, and spontaneous fits of glossolalia, speaking in tongues. According to the few surviving fragments of intercepted correspondence, Las Hilanderas believed they were recreating the trial of Guadalupe, not reenacting it, recreating it, step by step, but in reverse. Where Bejarano had been judged, they now sat as judges. Where she had been sentenced, they now delivered sentences, but their punishments weren't death, they were erasure. Records vanished, histories rewritten, entire generations cut from institutional lineage. One orphanage director in Sonora wrote in his final report before vanishing, "They are not violent, they are not loud, but when they come, the air dies. And afterward, it's as if the children never existed, as if even their memories have been stitched shut." Psychologists labeled it mass hysteria, but they couldn't explain how dozens of unrelated facilities across Mexico reported identical anomalies. down to the exact wording of dreams, symbols scratched into floorboards, and the presence of melted crucifixes. But even more chilling was the case of Maria Lobo, documented in a confidential state dossier leaked in 1971. Maria was a 13-year-old girl from Guadalajara who'd suffered severe abuse in a foster home. She was transferred to a Catholic asylum in Zacatecas. 3 months later, she stopped speaking entirely, not from trauma, but from conviction. She refused to utter a single word. Instead, she began sewing. Pillows, clothes, Bibles, anything she could find. But each thread formed an incomprehensible language, a kind of symbolic needle script no linguist could decipher. When questioned, she wrote in block letters on her wall, "Las palabras son armas del enemigo. Yo elijo el hilo." Words are weapons of the enemy. I choose thread. Her file notes that every night, she folded her clothes as if preparing for death. One nurse claimed to see Maria levitate during prayer. Another was found dead, lips sewn shut with surgical thread. The asylum burned down that same year. Maria's body was never found, and yet, in Chiapas, Baja California, and even Texas, murals began appearing, depicting a pale girl holding a needle in one hand and fire it on the other. The image became iconic, not as horror, but as revolution. Guadalupe Bejarano was no longer alone. Her code had been cracked. Her descendants were moving, not through bloodlines, through trauma, through silence, through institutional decay, through the very systems that once buried her. And as Las Hilanderas spread, one message echoed beneath their silence. You forgot her name, but she never forgot you. By the early 1970s, whispers of Las Hilanderas reached beyond the mountains of Oaxaca and into the corridors of international intelligence. In a declassified CIA report dated August 1973, stamped Red Level Cultural Hazard, Guadalupe Bejarano was listed not as a historical figure, but as a continuing influence of destabilizing psychological effect. No photo, no fingerprint, just a code name, Sutura Roja, Red Suture. What alarmed officials wasn't merely the spread of folklore, but the emergence of a counter-institution operating beneath the surface of post-colonial Catholic Latin America. One with no leader, no doctrine, no political party, only rituals, memory, and revenge. It was as if Bejarano's soul had broken into fragments and possessed a generation of forgotten girls, stitching itself into their dreams until they no longer believed in help, only in precision. A secret informant embedded in a Monterrey shelter reported witnessing a midnight ceremony where 6 girls, none older than 14, gathered in a basement. They held surgical scissors over their palms, chanting in what appeared to be a phonetic reversal of the Latin Magnificat. On the wall behind them, a portrait of Bejarano made entirely of bone fragments and teeth. Animal or human, unclear. The informant wrote, "They speak of her as if she never died, as if she's a condition, not a person. They believe every institution built on control must one day be turned inside out. They call that day El Corte, the severing." The Vatican, growing uneasy, dispatched a Jesuit delegation to investigate. Only one returned. Father Anselmo Reiner, a scholar of mysticism and demonic possession, delivered a chilling address in Rome. This is no cult. It is a contagion of silence, an ideological virus carried in suffering, and it wears the face of a woman who was never allowed to scream. He was later found catatonic, endlessly sewing a cassock that spelled out Bejarano's full confession, letter by letter, in black thread. Meanwhile, government records across Mexico began to show unusual patterns, entire case files erased, asylum logs replaced with blank pages, and mental health wards left eerily empty, not closed, emptied, as if the patients had evaporated. But on every site, a common trace was left behind, a folded note with a single phrase written in blood-red ink, La Madre nos cose, the mother sews us. By 1975, these disappearances spread northward into Texas, Arizona, and California. In El Paso, a group of teenage girls disappeared from a Catholic foster facility, leaving behind only their school uniforms arranged in a perfect spiral. One surviving nun reported hearing soft lullabies sung in perfect harmony from inside the walls. Local authorities dismissed it as mass runaway behavior, but behind closed doors, a deeper fear took root. The girls weren't running, they were recruiting. They moved through forgotten systems, border detention centers, juvenile prisons, abandoned psychiatric hospitals, places where the unwanted were warehoused, not healed. And each time they passed through, records vanished, names disappeared, and in their place, a new pattern emerged. Women in power began to rise, not publicly, not politically, but quietly, taking key roles in institutions once used to crush women like Bejarano. Hospitals, clinics, academic chairs, even prison boards. And almost every one of them, when traced back, had some obscure connection to an orphanage, a shelter, or a sanitarium between the years 1955 and 1970. None gave interviews, none wrote memoirs. But all of them wore one common item, a crimson-stitched ring on their left index finger. Was it coincidence or initiation? No one could prove it. But Bejarano's face began appearing in strange places, stitched into church pews, carved into asylum walls, drawn in ash across border fences, not smiling, not screaming, just watching. And then, in 1977, a letter surfaced, addressed to no one, authored by no one, but sealed with surgical thread. Inside, 12 pages of handwritten prose in Nahuatl, Latin, and Spanish. Its final line read, "We are the suture, the wound remembers, and the silence is over." The modern world had failed to bury Guadalupe Bejarano. Because she had never been buried, she had been woven into the fabric of the forgotten, the abused, the erased. And now the fabric was unraveling. In 1981, a fire tore through the archival wing of the University of Michoacán. Official reports blamed faulty wiring, but what was destroyed told another story. 117 years of sealed medical files, asylum interviews, and confessions from the Bejarano era. All of them gone, except one. A single carbon copy, charred at the edges, was recovered from a locked filing cabinet that miraculously survived the flames. It was a transcript dictated by an unnamed nurse in 1865 of a patient who had been institutionalized at Las Hilanderas shortly before its closure. The nurse's handwriting was erratic, the language archaic, but one phrase repeated again and again. The girl with scissors for fingers spoke in red. No one had ever described Guadalupe Bejarano that way. Not in any published record, not in any known photograph. But among the circle of modern folklorists and forensic mythologists, this image began to spread like a coded virus. A girl with scissors for fingers. It wasn't a literal description, it was a symbolic warning. Because by 1983, incidents began appearing far from Mexico. A psychiatric hospital in Marseille reported the sudden, unexplained death of 4 orderlies. Their throats were severed, clean and exact, as if by surgical tools. The only witness, a blind patient, muttered the same word repeatedly, Bejarano. When asked how he knew that name, he replied, "She comes in silence, and she doesn't walk, she stitches." The case was buried under international jurisdiction disputes, but whispers began to form. Something was moving, not a woman, but a method, a way of undoing systems from within, a silent unraveling. Former CIA operative Lucia Grant, who had once studied cult infiltration, released a privately published manifesto in 1986 titled The Seamstress Protocol. In it, she claimed that Bejarano's followers operated like a psychic insurgency, not tied by time, but by trauma, not driven by politics but by memory. She described a pattern of activation. Girls who experienced near-death abuse or institutional silence would enter what she called the crimson trance. Following this, they would disappear from conventional records and reappear years later as administrators, therapists, or advisors in the very systems that once harmed them. No fingerprints, no trails, only the ring. The crimson-stitched ring. In 1989, the Vatican quietly classified Las Hilanderas as a site of unresolvable spiritual infection. Pilgrimages were forbidden, a perimeter was established. But local villagers ignored it. They claimed the land still wept at night, and that some had seen children walking out of the ruins barefoot, holding hands, speaking in unison. Even the Mexican government, long silent, released an internal memo acknowledging the growing folklore, but warning officials to avoid public statements. Why? Because any recognition of Bejarano's story increased her power. A myth once acknowledged becomes memory, and memory once legitimized becomes contagion. Meanwhile, in major cities across the world, Los Angeles, Istanbul, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, a strange phenomenon began taking place. Psychiatric patients, mostly women, began requesting thread and needles during their episodes, not to harm, but to sew. They stitched names, they stitched warnings, they stitched anatomical maps of the human nervous system, perfectly accurate, despite having no medical background. Some sewed their mouths shut in protest, others embroidered symbols into their skin, spindles, threads, the number 74, the number of unmarked graves found beneath Las Hilanderas. But the most disturbing reports came from prison systems. Female inmates in high-security psychiatric wings began forming hierarchies, not gangs, not religious groups, but sewing circles. And they weren't just stitching, they were strategizing. One warden confessed anonymously, they're organizing something, not riots, not escape plans, something deeper, something colder. They call it La Restauración, the restoration. The restoration of what? Power, balance, or perhaps just memory? The name Bejarano was never spoken aloud, but her initials appeared on prison walls, on medical charts, on the backs of mirrors, always faint, always stitched. And with every appearance, another institution fractured, a corrupt orphanage closed, a violent asylum defunded, a prison psychiatrist exposed. It was as if history itself was being unraveled, thread by thread. Not loudly, not with fire and rebellion, but with silence and precision. The ghost of Guadalupe Bejarano wasn't seeking vengeance. She was performing surgery, and the world was the patient. They say history is written by the victors, but what if the victors were liars? And what if the real truth was stitched in secret, hidden beneath floorboards, behind padded walls, within the hollow bones of 1,000 institutional halls? The story of Guadalupe Bejarano did not end in 1870. It never ended. It metastasized. It grew, not as a legend, but as a living pattern, a blueprint for the invisible war raging inside every system built to suppress the human spirit. By 2025, a quiet investigation led by anonymous archivists and rogue historians culminated in a report titled Pattern 74, Institutional Parasitism and the Bejarano Code. It was not released publicly. Only 13 printed copies were made. Each copy vanished from circulation within 6 weeks. The core thesis, that Bejarano's life, incarceration, and eventual disappearance were not random horrors of the past, but part of a self-replicating mechanism, a psychological virus embedded into institutions, one that could only be activated under specific circumstances. Prolonged exposure to institutional gaslighting, witnessing abuse normalized as treatment, total emotional disconnection from official reality. The offering of the thread, that last detail, the offering of the thread, became central to everything, because those who survived the Bejarano method reported the same event, a moment when a faceless figure handed them a spool of crimson thread and whispered, "Do not scream, stitch." No one ever saw the figure again, but every survivor who took the thread went on to become anomalous. They healed faster, spoke less, observed more, and often, years later, rose to positions of unexpected influence: librarians, archivists, midwives, investigative journalists, forensic artists, always invisible, always meticulous. These weren't heroes, they weren't even rebels, they were editors of reality, sewing the truth back into the pages of history, one forbidden stitch at a time. And as their influence grew, the institutions began to collapse. Between 2010 and 2023, 5 high-profile private mental health facilities were shuttered due to internal sabotage. Records were erased, financial trails vanished. Survivors, many who claimed to hear the sewing, reported identical dreams, the rusted gates of Las Hilanderas swinging open, and a figure in a stitched red gown walking through, barefoot, carrying a lantern and scissors. One dreamer, a retired FBI profiler, described it like this: "It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. She wasn't angry, she was efficient, like a surgeon correcting a fatal diagnosis." So who was Guadalupe Bejarano, really? Was she Mexico's first serial killer, a madwoman twisted by trauma, a pawn of state-sanctioned horror? Or was she something more? An idea, a ritual, a prototype of feminine vengeance forged not in blood, but in precision. Modern cult theorists argue that Bejarano represents the anti-institutional feminine archetype, a force that does not scream or riot, but corrects. She doesn't burn systems, she exposes their stitching, and then she pulls. In recent years, a strange phrase has appeared across digital forums, spray-painted on old hospitals, and whispered in therapy groups. The thread is in your hands now. It's not a threat, it's a reminder. Because the story of Guadalupe Bejarano is not about what was done to her, it's about what she did in response, and what she taught others to do in silence. To observe, to remember, to stitch, to unravel. She was never caught because she was never running. She simply walked forward, needle in hand, and waited for the world to tear itself apart by its own corrupted seams. And maybe that's why her name still circulates, not in books, not in news, but in breath, in instinct, in every girl who walks into a room full of authority figures and sees through the facade. In every forgotten woman who stares at the wall and whispers, "I remember." In every stitched mouth that one day begins to smile. Not because they're free, but because they finally understand how to undo the cage.